Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio Music Production. This is lesson 3.23, and in this lesson we're going to talk about the Delay-2 effect. So we've already talked about the Delay-1, and it only makes sense to move on and talk about the Delay-2, mainly because they're very similar effects. But the Delay-2 has just a couple of new parameters which we're going to touch on and explain just how exactly those new parameters can maybe be used in a creation-based context, so to come up with new and interesting things. And just it's always helpful to kind of look at each parameter in any one of these effects to then realize that we're making maybe wiser choices when we're screwing around and just experimenting, which I encourage you to do after we cover each and every one of these effects, because if you do that, you realize just how powerful each and every one of these guys is on their own, which hopefully, if you did the creation project with the Delay-1, you could see just how powerful that very small little plugin can be. So let's just go ahead and jump straight in. I'm going to head over to Bitwig Studio here, and I'm going to load up our Delay-1. And I'm going to load up our Delay-2. So right off the bat, we can see that there's some pretty obvious similarities here. We have the same controls for the most part, at least the same major controls. We have a feedback control, which we know what that does. We have high and low cut filters. We know what those do. We have our mix parameter. We already know what that does. We have the offset. We know what that does as well. And then we have the ability to either go into kind of an independent delay time setting, so we could set it at a millisecond amount up to a couple of seconds, I believe. And we also then could go into sync mode, which is going to make our delays occur at, I guess you would say, musically logical places. So right now we're at 4/16. That would be a quarter note, so a quarter note based on our 60 BPM or whatever tempo you might have going at the top there. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete this Delay-1. Right off the bat, we notice that instead of just one delay, we have two, and thus it's called the Delay-2. We have a left and a right delay, and we have an input setting here. Now, for the most part, you're probably going to want to keep this at left and right. And if you're working with either a mono signal, which I'm working with right now, if you're working with that mono signal, it really doesn't matter if you're either in left, right, right, left, mono. It's not going to make too much of a difference because the signal itself isn't in stereo. So flipping this around isn't going to make any difference at all. Now, let's say, for example, you had two guitars. Okay, so maybe you had two slightly different electric guitars. Their timbres a little bit differently. Those were both recorded in stereo. You mixed one slightly off to the left. You mixed the other one slightly off to the right. You combine those two. You bounce that track out. And now suddenly you want to do a little delay. At that point, maybe it would be interesting to flip-flop it around and set the right channel to actually go into this left delay and the left channel to go into the right delay. It all is confusing to me right now, and since we're not even working with something in stereo, at least none of these samples I believe are really in stereo, I'm just going to leave it as it is. But that's something to screw around with, especially if you have samples that are really stereo, and you know what those samples are when you hear them. The new parameters we have in here are detune, rate, width, which is really the biggie, and then we have a crossfeed control, which is one of the more confusing controls I've ever seen on a delay in my life. We're going to talk about what the crossfeed does towards the end of this video. But for now, the first thing I always like to do when I bring in a new effect, or even when I bring in an effect I'm very familiar with, is I kind of like to strip it back and start with something that's really basic, really simple to understand. So as I'm making changes, I can really hear what's happening. It's not just like I'm turning one thing but everything else is staying the same, because that doesn't make a whole lot of sense for me. So right now, let's listen to what we have with this delay as it is. All right, I hear a lot going on there, and so I'm going to try to strip this back so that we're just getting one instance of a delay and we're not making any timbral changes to it. So first things first, I'm going to turn this crossfeed down to 0 for both. I'll turn the feedback down to 0, and we remember from the Delay-1, if our feedback is all the way at 0, we're just going to get one repeat. So hopefully now if I play this back, we'll just have one repeat. Very nice. I'm going to turn this detune down. You can see as I'm turning it, it's giving me a sense indicator. So I know if I go down to 0, that that's having absolutely 0 effect. But just to be safe, I'll pull the rate down to 0 as well. I'll open up this high cut filter, pull down this low cut filter, and we know that they're all the way up because this is at 20K and this is down around 20 hertz. The width parameter for now, I'm going to pull down to 0. It's interesting, this can actually go above 100%. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then with the mix, I'm just going to bring this up a little bit. Now let's play this back and hear what we have. So one very interesting thing you're going to hear if you're listening very closely is that that's actually not a perfect replication of our original signal. Why is that the case? Honestly, I'm not 100% sure. My theory is that whenever you kind of are lumping delays together, and in this case, we have 2 independent delays. That's what delay 2 means. We have a left and we have a right. Once you put those on top of each other and you put this width down to 0, which is really kind of monoing it all out, you're going to get some phasing happening because these 2 delays cannot really work together perfectly without introducing some of that phase that we've talked about. So I think some of the frequency content is actually being lost here, even though these 2 guys are set exactly the same. But right away, if I change one of these to 2 and one of these to 3, we're going to hear that now suddenly we're kind of hearing that full snare again. So let's take a listen to that. Very interesting, if you ask me. That was one of the cooler things that I discovered using this particular delay when I was experimenting with it. And now we do have what I would consider to be more of like a very initialized setting. So don't forget that you can always open this up and you can save the preset. And I'm going to call this Brian Delay-2 init. And I could put this specifically as a delay if I wanted to under my categories, and I'll layer this as an effect, and that's pretty much good for me. So now I have that preset saved and I can call that up whenever I want. But for the most part, I'd probably start with it at that setting that it came up with and then just pull things back because it only takes really about a minute or so. So let's see what's new here. The first parameter, perhaps the most important one, is the width. So I'm just going to play back our snare and I'm going to slowly pull this width control up and you're going to hear what it's able to do. It will help if I actually set these to different values. And we're going over 100% now. And we know if I want to exaggerate this, I can just bump the feedback up so we get this going a little longer. Okay, so that sounds pretty cool to me. All of these parameters we're very familiar with, so I'm not going to go over any of these anymore. We know if we want to set one of these into a manual time, we could do that by just selecting here and then, moving this down. But for now, let's go ahead and keep this sync, even though that does sound pretty cool. Touching on some of the newer settings we have here, I'm going to go back and set this to quarter notes again. Actually, I'm going to do something a little bit different. Let's go ahead and set this to half notes. And let's mess around with this detune parameter. And I'm going to do it with the chord because we're going to get a better understanding of what's going on. So let's strip all of this back real quick. I'll leave the width up just a little bit, but actually let's pull it all the way down so you can really hear what's happening. So if we look at this inside of our spectrum right now with the settings we have, this is what we got. Let's change this to an entire 1 bar. Right? So not a whole lot of difference. One of the ways we could have changed this in the past would have been to like modulate the high cut and the low cut filters so that we were getting some timbral change with that delay, and we can listen to that now. Right, very straightforward, but I want you to notice how for the most part everything is the same there. In terms of the spikes on those harmonics, I am zoomed in a little bit so we could zoom out, but really nothing is being added and there's not a whole lot of movement, especially not movement left to right. But let's see what happens now if I mess with this detune and rate parameter. So I'm just going to detune this a bunch. Let's see what happens now. So all of a sudden, a ton more content, and we're getting some of that left to right movement. That's really what the detuning is doing. And based on the rate, that's going to indicate how fast that's happening, okay? So it's not going to ever go more than a whole semitone, which we can get up to if we go to 100 cents, or we can make it very subtle and do something like 12, which I'll leave at 12 right now, and we're still going to be able to hear a difference. That sounds pretty cool. We could speed up the rate. And we can even make those movements in real time, or we could put those in as automation. What I want you to get out of this is that this change is very different from this change, okay? This is filters, so we're basically just cutting out harmonics. As opposed to actually kind of changing what's going on in the frequency spectrum, and specifically that left to right, very subtle movement. And you can hear just how big of a timbral change that makes on the sound. The last thing to really talk about here is the crossfeed. So this one's a little bit more confusing. I'm just going to play back the snare here, and I'm going to mess with the crossfeed a little bit after changing these feedback parameters. And at that point, I'll go in and I'll actually try to explain exactly what's happening with the crossfeed. So let's mess around a little bit, see what we can come up with here. So what I want you to really focus on is not what it says here, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. When you highlight over crossfeed, it says the amount of the signal which is fed over to the input of the left channel. Doesn't make any sense to me. But if I actually click and drag, you're seeing this little indicator that comes up that says left greater than right. So if we're all the way down to negative infinity, okay, that means that the left is 100% greater than the right. So the left is working totally independently. It's not taking into account anything that's happening on the right. If I pull this all the way up and we go to 0 dB, it means that in no way is the left channel any greater than the right. And a lot of the emphasis now is going to be placed onto that right channel. So really it's trying to, in a way, it's trying to control just how far you can push the width and the difference between the left and the right channel. So let me just play back again, try to listen to that, try to make sense of it in your head. It's really just another control that to me can give you a little bit of that extra I don't know, flexibility over your width, specifically in your left and your right channel. You can really hear the emphasis on the right now. And ironically, if I pull this up, you're going to start to hear emphasis being pushed back to the left. That's really kooky, isn't it? It's kind of something I've never seen on any delay plugin in my life, and it leads to some pretty interesting results. So that's something you kind of have to play around with. I don't really know how to explain it. I'm not an expert on any of this stuff. So to try to technically explain crossfeed is a little hard for me to do, but what I can provide you with is a little bit of a Wikipedia definition of what crossfeed is. So let's take a look at this first paragraph. I'll actually link to this whole page here on the description for the video, and if you read through it, all of this might make a little bit more sense to you. But basically, what Wikipedia has to say is crossfeed is the process of blending the left and right channels of a stereo audio recording. It is generally used to reduce the extreme channel separation often featured in early stereo recordings, or to make audio played through headphones, which is probably what most of us are using, sound more natural, like when you listen through a pair of external speakers, right? So if you have monitors set up like I do here, and you pan something and do crazy ping pong delay, it never has that same kind of effect as you get with your headphones. It always sounds a little more subtle, and it does sound a little bit more natural. So crossfeed is claimed, I don't think this has ever been proven, to provide relief for a small fraction of listeners who otherwise complain of fatigue and headache when they listen to stereo recordings. So that's a basic definition. And when you take that definition and then implement it to what's happening here with our Delay-2, it starts to make a little bit more sense. So it tries to wean in that really dramatic effect as when you have the width way, way up. Now, for the same reason, I feel like you could kind of just pull the width back down to 100, and then you wouldn't really have to use the crossfeed. But I've noticed using the crossfeed, you get some other pretty dramatic and different effects that you can't come up with otherwise using this particular device. So when you are working with the Delay-2, and if you're doing something really complex and really crazy, don't be afraid, to map one of these macros to the crossfeed and subtly change it over time, because it's going to give you different delay combinations and timings with the left and right channel that you can't get otherwise. But how to explain it, I don't really know. It's something very different, something I've never really encountered before, but at the same time, it's something I'm pretty interested and excited about messing around with in the future. So that's the Delay-2 device. Pretty simple. We've covered most of these things. Go out, experiment, see what you can come up with. One thing to be kind of weary of, which I've noticed, is if you go into free run mode and you take these times way down. So if I was at even, I don't know, let's say 16 for that, and 20 odd for this one. If we play this back, we're going to get kind of this nasty feedback. Well, at least that's what's happened to me before. Let's pull our feedbacks down, though, for right now. Now we'll mess with crossfeed just to see what happens. So you can see that when we take these times way down, we start to get these absolutely crazy distortion effects occurring, which, to be 100% honest, I don't know why that's happening, but it's something that I've come across, and maybe it's something you could use to creative effect. I don't know just yet how I might implement that in and whether or not that's a coding flaw or if that's supposed to happen for any reason. Again, when you have two delay channels like this and it's trying to prevent like phasing from occurring, I could imagine that there is something that, in the circuitry just shouldn't happen, and therefore it's causing some of those artifacts to occur. But again, I'm not an expert, I'm not a genius. I just kind of uncover things and then I leave it for all the greater minds than my own to figure out why it happens. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you again in the next lesson. Take care.